truth, it should never have been called Pickett's charge. General George Pickett commanded only one of the 3 divisions that stepped into that mile of fire. Pettigrew's North Carolinians and Trimble's mixed brigades fought and bled just as much, and the plan itself was Robert E. Lee's. But history often favors the image over the reality. Pickett's Virginians were fresh, unbloodied until that day, and placed at the center of the advance. They marched with perfect lines, banners high, into the teeth of the Union guns, and it was their gallant but doomed image that burned into memory. After the war, Virginia veterans, along with Pickett himself, ensured his name became forever linked to the charge. Longstreet, who opposed the assault, fell from favor in Southern memory, and his name was never attached to it. Pettigrew and Trimble, both wounded that day, lacked the post-war voice to claim their share of the story, and so the name endured, short, dramatic, and tragic. Pickett's charge, a march into the heart of death, remembered for its valor, its futility, and the moment it marked, the high-water mark of the Confederacy. Chapter 1. The Reluctant Order. The sun climbed over Gettysburg with the slow inevitability of fate. Its early light caught the haze hanging over the fields, smoke from the battles of the previous 2 days, now mixed with the faint, acrid bite of burnt powder. Crows wheeled over shattered fences. Somewhere, a single cannon fired, not in anger, but as if to remind the armies that war had not yet spent itself. By July 3rd, both armies were battered. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had struck hard on July 1st and 2nd, driving deep into the Union flanks, yet the Federal line still held. And here, on the ridges south of town, Lee believed the moment had come to shatter the enemy once and for all. In a small orchard west of Seminary Ridge, General Robert E. Lee stood with arms behind his back, listening more than speaking. The great man was calm, but in his mind a plan was set: strike the Union center, where the line along Cemetery Ridge seemed thinnest. Break it, and the Union army would crumble. Lee turned to the man who would command the attack. "General Longstreet," Lee said, "I believe the enemy is there for the taking." Longstreet's eyes narrowed. He was a fighter, and a good one, but he could see the field as clearly as any man alive. Nearly a mile of open ground, gently rising toward the enemy's guns. The Federals would have a clear shot all the way. "Sir," he said slowly, "I fear this attack will fail. We should maneuver them out of that position, not charge it." Lee's voice remained even, yet the decision had already been made. "The enemy is there, General, and I am going to strike him there." Longstreet knew nothing more could be said. The burden was his now, whether he liked it or not. Word soon reached Major General George Pickett. His division, 3 brigades of fresh Virginians, had yet to fire a shot in this battle. Pickett rode among his men with an almost theatrical grace, long hair curling beneath his hat, his gray coat immaculate despite the dust. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Glory was at hand. Colonel Lewis Armistead, a veteran of many fights, watched Pickett with quiet affection. He too was a Virginian, though his mind was less on glory and more on the faces of the men he would lead across that deadly ground. Some were boys barely old enough to shave. Others had marched since the peninsula. Armistead knew too well how many would never return. This was not simply Pickett's attack. 2 other divisions would join, Pettigrew's North Carolinians and Trimble's men from Pender's battered division. In total, nearly 12,000 would step forward. The plan was to hammer the Union center with artillery, then send the infantry across in one great wave. Break the line, end the battle. The men made ready. Cartridge boxes were checked, canteens filled. Some wrote quick letters, trusting them to friends who would remain behind. There was laughter, forced and brittle. One soldier took a tin of peaches from his haversack, declaring that he'd eat them on Cemetery Hill that afternoon. Another simply sat on the grass, head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. From the Union side, the ridge stood quiet, its defenders hidden by the curve of the slope. But the quiet was an illusion. Behind that ridge lay rows of cannon, thousands of muskets, and men determined not to yield a single stone. Longstreet rode the line one last time, speaking little. Pickett, ever the showman, saluted smartly as the corps commander passed. If Longstreet returned the gesture, it was only the briefest nod. The stage was set. The orders were given. In that hour on that summer day, the men believed, some in victory, some only in duty. Chapter 2. The Guns Speak. The hour before noon passed in restless waiting. Heat shimmered above the ridgeline, and the air lay heavy, pressing down on wool coats and sweat-damp shirts. A light wind stirred the grass, carrying with it the mingled scents of churned earth, gun oil, and the faint sweetness of clover. General Lee intended this assault to begin with the greatest artillery bombardment of the war. If the Union center could be pounded into submission, the infantry might cross that open mile and live to tell of it. Along Seminary Ridge, more than 150 Confederate guns were rolled into position, ammunition chests pried open. The gunners stripped to shirt sleeves, rammers and sponges in hand, waiting for the signal. Shortly after 1 o'clock it came. A single cannon barked, one deep-throated report, and in an instant the line erupted. The ground shook as if the earth itself were breaking. Shells screamed overhead toward Cemetery Ridge. From the Union side, the guns answered, and the air between the lines became a place no living thing could survive. Men of Pickett's division hugged the reverse slope, lying flat to escape the worst of the fire. Dirt and stones rained down as incoming shells burst in geysers of soil. The noise was beyond description, a physical thing that beat against the chest and rattled the teeth. The Confederate fire was not as effective as Lee hoped. Many of the guns overshot, their shells bursting harmlessly behind the Union line. Smoke, thick as fog, obscured the ridge and blinded the gunners. In their minds, the silence of certain Union batteries meant they had been knocked out, when in truth Federal officers had ordered them to hold their fire, conserving ammunition for what they knew was coming. On Cemetery Ridge, Union infantry crouched behind stone walls and low breastworks. The men of the Second Corps waited with muskets loaded, watching the great gray cloud boil on the far ridge. Among them, General Winfield Scott Hancock rode calmly along the line, his hat tipped back, speaking in a voice so steady that it steadied others. Back on Seminary Ridge, Longstreet sat his horse, hands tight on the reins. He knew the signal would soon come to send the men forward. He had seen such attacks before, had seen them fail. The barrage dragged on for nearly 2 hours. By the end, the air was so choked with smoke that the sun became no more than a pale disk, like a lantern behind frosted glass. The roar began to fade, the guns falling silent one by one. Now came the moment. Pickett swung into the saddle, calling for his brigade commanders, Garnett, Armistead, and Kemper, to form the lines. Officers shouted orders, sergeants pushed men into alignment. You didn't have to be told. All you had to do is look to see the enormity of the task laid before them, nearly a mile of open ground, broken only by a few shallow dips. 2 fences along the Emmitsburg Road, and then the long climb toward the Union guns. Pickett's voice rang out, full of confidence. "Forward, men. Remember old Virginia." And with that, the lines began to move. They stepped from the shelter of the ridge into the open, banners snapping above them, the sun glinting on bayonets. In that moment, they were still whole, still proud. The storm had not yet broken upon them, but it was coming. Chapter 3. The Bloody Angle. From the moment they stepped into the open, the fate of the assault began to take shape. The first shells fell among Pettigrew's North Carolinians on the left, tearing gaps in the ranks that were quickly closed by men who knew they might be next. Trimble's division followed behind, grim and silent. Pickett's Virginians held the right, their lines dressed with parade ground precision, a magnificent sight even to the enemy. The Union gunners had been waiting. When the gray lines reached the halfway point, the ridge ahead erupted. Batteries that had lain quiet during the bombardment now roared to life, firing double canister, hundreds of iron balls in each blast, sweeping the field like a giant scythe. The advance slowed, not from hesitation but from the fences along the Emmitsburg Road. Men clambered over rails under a storm of shot and shell. The neat lines broke, reformed, broke again. Flags still waved defiantly, though every color bearer seemed to draw fire like a magnet. On the left, Pettigrew's line began to crumble under the pressure. Flanking fire from Union troops, posted behind a low stone wall, cut into them without mercy. Trimble pushed forward into the gap, but the weight of metal and lead was too great. The left began to drift back, leaving Pickett's division more and more exposed. Still, the Virginians came on. General Richard Garnett, feverish and ill, rode his horse into the storm, refusing to show weakness. He vanished in the smoke and did not return. Kemper went down with a bullet in the thigh, trying to urge his men forward, and at the front of the right brigade, hat raised high on the tip of his sword, came Lewis Armistead. His voice cut through the din. "Come on, boys, give them the cold steel." The stone wall loomed ahead, Cemetery Ridge, the center of the Union line. Union musketry crashed at point-blank range, and men fell in heaps against the wall. Somehow Armistead and a small knot of survivors clambered over, bayonets flashing in the sun. For a brief, furious moment, they drove the defenders back. This was the farthest any Confederate force would come, the place history would call the high water mark of the Confederacy. But there would be no breakthrough. Union reserves surged forward, blue lines closing around the breach. Armistead fell, mortally wounded, beside a captured Union gun. The remnant of Pickett's division was forced back, step by bloody step, across the same ground they had just crossed. Longstreet watched it all, his face like stone. Lee, on another part of the ridge, urged the survivors to rally, telling them it was his fault. But no words could change what had been done. In less than an hour, over half the men who stepped forward were dead, wounded, or captured. They called it Pickett's charge, though Pettigrew's and Trimble's men had bled just as freely. It was Lee's plan, Longstreet's command, and the courage, or futility, of thousands. The field fell quiet again as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Smoke drifted in long, ragged banners, and across that mile of open ground lay the shattered dream of breaking the Union line. The war would go on for nearly 2 more years, but here, On this ridge at Gettysburg, the tide had turned.